So now I think I'd like to talk about how I achieve the best video file size with the most quality maintained in the video. So how do I achieve the best quality to size ratio? I've talked about this in the past, but that's changed quite a bit since we last spoke. So I'm going to give an update on exactly how I do it now because I've made some major improvements to that workflow. So just to give you a little bit of background, I like to basically minimize the quality loss in my videos, but also have the videos be as small as possible. So how do I achieve that? Well, typically I like to export my videos in uncompressed format, or at least a lossless format where you don't notice any quality loss. And then I like to process it in Handbrake using something called CRF factor. So typically when you encode or transcode a video, you'll typically do it based on the bit rate, which is basically how much data is allowed to be stored at any given time. So obviously if you were to record a very high resolution, if you want to be able to store everything, then you're saving a ton of data at one time. Whereas if it's like low resolution, you're not saving that much data at any given time. Because you're constantly recording, that's how we actually think of it. How much data are you saving at any given time? So we can limit that, but when we limit it, typically there's a loss in quality where we limit how much data is saved at one time. But there's also the aspect that most of the time, the rate that we save data at, which is in kilobits per second typically. So of course, the lower the kilobits per second, the worse the quality is because it can only store so much data at one time, which means I can only do so much with that limit that it's able to store data at. Like right now, the quality should look fairly decent, I would think, because I'm not all that strict with how much data saves at once. If I was, this would look a lot worse. Maybe I'll do a demo of what that looks like, but I might not even want to waste time editing that kind of stuff. One of the goals with these casual videos is to minimize editing. If you're watching an excerpt, this is originally on a casual video. Anyway, so obviously we want to be able to store a certain amount of data at once if we want the best quality. Now the problem with that is most of the time the rate that we store data at is overkill. Meaning there's a lot of times we could get away with a lower rate, but there's also some rare situations where we can't get away with that lower rate. Tom Scott made a video talking about why confetti ruins YouTube video quality. I may reference it up here. We'll have to wait and see. But anyway, that kind of explains why confetti could look terrible on video, and it has to do with this very concept right here. The bit rate is limited. So one of the techniques that's actually used to make videos as small as they are is of course compression. And one of the ways it does that is rather than storing full images, it stores an image every once in a while, and then it stores changes between that image and where we are in this given moment. So each full image that it takes, well, what you're seeing right now is not a whole bunch of images necessarily. What you're actually seeing is changes that happen since a full image. That might not really make a lot of sense. I'm making this, well, I'm not making it up on the spot. I'm explaining it on the spot. But anyways, so basically, rather than taking a full image like we would take with our phone or something, it does it at a certain interval. It takes a full image at a certain interval. Let's say it does it every 5 seconds. That's not a conventional rate. It'll probably be like every 10 seconds, every 3 seconds, 2 or 1 second. it'll take a full image. And then everything else in between is just changes since that last full image. You could watch the Tom Scott video, which I think should go over it. But each full image is called a keyframe. So if you have a keyframe interval of, let's say, 3 seconds, a full image will be taken every 3 seconds. Everything in between is really just changes. So all this motion, this is not stored in like 100 different images. It's stored in maybe 1 or 2 images, but the encoder and decoder basically knows what changed since that last keyframe. And it just represents the changes based on what changed since that last keyframe. That's one way we could save space. That's why that's relevant. So that's one way we could keep the size down as much as we do. But yeah, a lot of times the size is overkill for what you're actually doing. What I'm actually trying to also get at is if there's a lot of motion, that's when the quality could get really bad with confetti and stuff. As Tom Scott demonstrates, if there's no motion with confetti, if it's frozen in midair, then it doesn't look that bad. Because again, it's storing changes. And if there's a lot of changes that happen at once, it needs a lot more data to keep track of all these different changes that happen. There could be like millions of changes per second. Easy. But if it's 0 changes per second, no problem. You hardly need anything to store that. So anyway, related to how much data is getting stored at once, most of the time the rate that data is stored at is overkill. It actually depends on the situation, but for my videos typically it is overkill. So I could set it to a lower rate, but at the moments where there's a lot of motion and other areas where it just needs to be higher, there will be a quality loss. So you'll notice on some videos it looks pretty good most of the time, but when there's a lot of motion, like if I'm in a terminal and there's a whole bunch of text moving at once, then the quality is going to look really bad. Rather than just having some hard limit for what rate data is stored at, you can also store it based on the quality. So there's a utility called Handbrake that can store things based on a quality factor rather than an actual amount of data that's getting stored at once. So at any given time, it'll do whatever rate is needed to achieve a given quality. So rather than targeting how much data is getting stored at once at pretty much a flat rate, it's targeting what quality needs to get stored and how much data is actually needed to store things at this quality. So typically when there's not a lot of motion, it's really low. When there's a lot of motion, it's way up here, possibly even higher than a high bit rate you may set. But the thing is, the overall amount of data that's actually stored is probably still going to be a lot less, because most of the time it can be low when the data rate needs to be low, then it can be high when it needs to be high. So when you look at the big picture of where everything is stored rather than at a flat rate, it'll be like this, and the overall size will be less because most of the time it doesn't need to store that much at once, and then the time it does need to store a lot to achieve a certain quality, it can. So that's how you can actually save a bunch of space while having a really good quality. Have the rate high when it needs to be high and low when it needs to be low, which is the case most of the time. Now that depends on the video too. If it's a video with a lot of motion and just detail overall, you're actually not going to save space based on the quality at all. You're going to have to set some sort of hard limit, and it'll probably look pretty decent still even with that hard limit. But it's all dependent on the use case. For my videos where there's not a lot of motion, pretty much only me that's changing right now. The rest of the video is mostly the same. And then when I'm doing a screen recording, that's also the case. If I'm recording pixels, hardly anything changes on the screen compared to a camera. Cameras have much more changes in general than a screen recorder typically does. So there's some cases where cameras will not save size at all using this quality factor. There are some cases like mine where there's hardly any motion, where I will still get a pretty good size savings by doing that. So it's all dependent on the use case. Where do you benefit from targeting quality, and where do you benefit from targeting a hard rate where the quality is like way up here and you actually want to limit that? Where do you benefit from that? Depends on the use case. I say try the quality thing, and if it doesn't work, then just go with some bitrate. Either what it already is by default, or else targeting a bitrate when you encode another video, like if you've edited the video. So those are some of the differences between bitrate and then just CRF, or constant rate factor, which is based on the quality. Are you targeting a hard limit, or are you targeting whatever's required to achieve any given quality? Most of the time, targeting whatever is needed to achieve a quality is going to give me a massive size savings without quality loss. Because again, if I have a hard limit, most of the time that's overkill. I might be here on average when my hard limit's up here. And there might be some situations where I need stuff up here, in which case a hard limit is making the quality worse since it's not storing everything in between here. So if I do it based on the quality, it can do whatever it needs. And for me, the net size, or the net rate, which is like the average rate across a whole video, is going to be pretty low. But there's certain areas where it will be high. But still, overall, I'm going to get a size savings. So you could use a CRF factor and handbrake to achieve that. So I'll just pull up handbrake real quick. So if I pull up handbrake on my system, I'll just drop in a random video. Okay, I may have chosen a poor example. This is an 8K video that I randomly chose. I don't usually deal with that. I picked a really bad example, but anyway, this is where you set that quality factor. I forgot to launch my zooming utility. So yeah, this is where you set the quality. So the lower the number, the higher the quality that I'm targeting. So if I want to target a pretty good quality overall, I find this tends to be a pretty good middle ground. If I do care about quality, I might go right here, or even right there, which is pretty much lossless. In a lot of situations, I can get away with this. It kind of depends on the video and where I care about quality. If there's like really subtle details that need to be noticed in a video, which is not the case most of the time, then I could go for a lower quality. I mean, yeah, if there's subtle details, I might go for something like this. Maybe I could get away with this, I'm not really sure. But in a video like this, I don't think there's gonna be any subtle details that I care about. So I could probably get away with this. If I'm publishing to YouTube, I might go with this. It depends. Basically, it comes down to experimenting and saving multiple copies of the video and deciding which one is satisfactory. You might have to experiment a little bit. You can probably map out the use cases and exactly what to go with. So maybe in a YouTube video, you always go with this one. Maybe in a more general video, you go with this. If you're archiving a video for your own purposes, maybe you go with that, for example. So that's where the quality factor kind of comes into play. Now the problem with that system is most video editors do not allow you to export with that right out of the box. It just doesn't let you do that. You typically have to do something with a bitrate or uncompressed. So since those are basically the only options, what I personally like to do is export it uncompressed and then bring it into this software right here to apply that CRF factor to it. And that's mainly to minimize the quality loss. So obviously with that concept of compression, we're typically adding compression, of course. And every time we do that, if we do that multiple times for the same video, we're adding compression multiple times. So as a result, there's going to be, the compression is going to compound over the course of time. So typically each layer of compression you do is considered a generation. And just because you lose a little bit of quality with each generation, you suffer from generational loss. And the reason I like to export uncompressed from my video editor and then bring it into here is so that I can minimize the generational loss. I could export a compressed file, then bring it in here, but I'm going to have a fair bit of generational loss that may end up being noticeable in some situations. So when I export uncompressed or lossless, then as far as I'm concerned, there's basically no quality loss in that generation of processing. So basically when I export an uncompressed video from the editor, then the quality is as it comes from the editor itself. It's like the quality is coming straight from the editor exactly how it was from there. So when I consider how many generations of loss there are, the original video probably has some compression with however that was recorded. I mean, right now I'm recording this video, obviously, so this is the first generation of the video. And there's going to be a little bit of quality loss within that itself. And then I bring it into the editor as the first generation. When I export stuff from the editor, that's the second generation. And then I'll be bringing it into this software, which is the third generation. And then if I decide to use some third generation footage in a later video, which sadly happens more than I care to admit, then when I export that, that's the fourth generation of that video. Most of the videos are going to be the second generation when that's exported, but third generation footage that was brought back in and re-exported is technically the fourth generation. And then if I process it in here, that's the fifth generation. And then also when I upload it to YouTube, YouTube does its own compression, so technically that's another generation by definition. 6 generations of quality loss potentially, that's a big deal. So I could have up to 6 generations of quality loss. And things might look crappy on your end, but they look perfectly fine with my original footage because you're experiencing a later generation that's had some quality loss compared to me. With my own videos, that is. So as you can see, generational loss can be a pretty big deal. There's even some videos by, I think Marquez Brownlee or MKBHD made the demonstration of this, as well as Epus Vox. Or did Epus Vox make a demonstration? I think Taryn Van Hamer did. There's quite a few YouTubers online that demonstrated that concept, and you'll notice the quality gets worse with each generation. That's just how it is. So generational loss is a pretty big deal. Because there's so many different generations, I want to minimize that generational loss. So I might seem a little bit insane when I export uncompressed footage from my editor, but I'm doing that to minimize this generational loss. Most people don't even really use this concept of achieving the best quality to size ratio, but since I don't want to invest in several different terabytes worth of storage, I try to get the best quality to size ratio using this system. To clarify, I delete these uncompressed videos when I'm done processing them. I don't keep them forever. So when I'm exporting uncompressed from the editor, or at least lossless, so basically I should have also clarified, lossless means that there's no visual data loss to the human eye. Whereas lossy, there is going to be a little bit of quality loss that might be noticeable, but it might not too, who knows. So when I export uncompressed, and I can guarantee that it's lossless, and as I do that, then I know that it's exactly how it is in the editor. What I encode is exactly how it was in the video editor itself. So when I do lossless and there's no quality loss, I don't even count that as a generation at all. So basically, then I have my original footage, which is the first generation, export uncompressed, which is exactly the same as it was in the editor over here. So that means there's, as far as I'm concerned, we're still in the first generation, even when I export it. Then I bring it into this software. This creates what I consider the second generation. So one of the ways of minimizing quality loss is minimizing generational loss. And of course, YouTube will be the third generation in this case. So there's basically 3 generations minimum, whether I like it or not, unless I decide not to do this CRF factor. But then I'm probably going to be exporting something from the editor that counts as a generation. Am I really going to be uploading uncompressed to YouTube? Especially if it takes like an hour or a terabyte per hour? Yeah, if I want to upload an hour-long video, that's a whole terabyte. Just don't. So yeah, I like to minimize the generational loss, and one of the ways I do that is exporting a lossless video from the video editor. So I used to do an uncompressed AVI for the past several years, but I recently switched to something else that I haven't talked about yet. So let's go over that now. So what I'm going to show you is actually on the Mac, because codec that I actually like to use now instead of uncompressed AVI is something that can only be exported on the Mac. So I typically use DaVinci Resolve as my video editor, and the codec that I like best is basically ProRes. In fact, I think EpisVox does exactly the same thing now. He really likes ProRes. So now I'm on the Mac instead of Windows, because the Mac is all that actually works with Apple ProRes exporting. On Windows you can import ProRes, but you can only export ProRes on DaVinci Resolve, and I think that's because it's proprietary with Mac, and DaVinci Resolve has locked it down. So yeah, let's come into a new project. If I come to here, then I can select QuickTime as the file container, Apple ProRes. This option is not on Windows as far as I'm aware, so I like to do it from the Mac, and this is what I typically choose. So when I export lossless from the video editor, these are typically my settings when I'm on Mac. I think you can do this in Linux too, at least CentOS based distributions, but on Mac this works. On Windows I just simply don't get this option. When I'm in QuickTime, ProRes just doesn't populate on this list. So basically I came down to what I do through experimentation and looking at different options and weighing the pros and cons of each. So ProRes was easily in the top of my list. but you can't export that on Windows. At least not with a bunch of tinkering around, if that's even possible. I don't care to mess around with that and find out. But if I'm on Windows and I can't use ProRes, I like to use DNxHR 444 10 bits. I like what that provides me. It pretty much provides me the same end result as far as I can tell. The size is a little bit different between them with the final result, but it's within like 500 megabytes, which is not that big of a deal on a really large video. I tend to make very large videos, as you're aware. You're probably watching one right now if you're not watching the excerpt of this. But then from here I can do whatever I want basically. So my current uncompressed preset is those settings that I just showed. That's what I prefer on the Mac. So if I'm on Mac, I use QuickTime Apple ProRes 422HQ. When I'm on Windows and don't have that option, then I do DNxHR 444 10 bits. I was looking at EXR and things like that too, which that's just an image format. It exports every frame as an image, which is about 25 megabytes per. So if it's 25 megabytes per frame, if you have a 30 frame per second video, 25 times 30 is literally how much space it takes just for 1 second of video. And that's in an image format, which isn't really watchable. I know that in the real world that will get used sometimes for uncompressed footage, but certainly not for me here. So those are the two options that I like to choose to minimize generational loss. I used to do AVI uncompressed, RGB 10-bit, I think. No, this is what I did, YUV 422 10-bit. That is what I used to do, but now I do those QuickTime options. And then I just bring it into Handbrake like you'd expect. Typically I render on the Mac, and then I bring it in to Handbrake on Windows. I like to have a portable SSD that I carry around. I render to that because the render speed is insane. And yeah, so then I can bring it to, let's say, my Intel Nook, which is like a secondary PC that I typically like to do processing on. I'll do it on the Mac from time to time too. Of course, Handbrake works on there as you'd expect. Oh jeez. So yeah, typically I'll do it on Windows though. But yeah, compared to uncompressed AVI, what I like about this better is AVI easily took up at least 6 times as much space, 6 times more space I should say, than the ProRes and all that. So I'm saving space massively with ProRes and basically getting the same results too. I was using like a terabyte per hour before, and that uses a lot of writes on the drive. That's kind of unnecessary. It's just a pain to work in too. But now that it's like 6 times smaller, in theory it takes about a terabyte for 6 hours worth of footage. That's a big deal for videos like these casual videos that I do. So it's a lot more convenient. I even wrote a program that helps me calculate the size estimate based on what it has been in the past. I'll show it to you real quick. I'll pull it up and we'll do a snap transition to pull it up. Ready? Okay, so basically what this does is it helps me estimate the size that these large files are going to end up taking. Sometimes it takes more than I would expect and I have to deal with that. I think I might have actually made a change to this now that I'm using ProRes. Yeah, this is what it used to be with AVI. So for 47 minutes and 27 seconds, it would take up 473.61 on the Mac, and that same number in Windows with the different units of measurement, GB and GIB. Those are basically the differences across the platforms, and I can predict what it would be on each corresponding platform. So based on a known time, I can interpolate using this math right here. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that I know my video is 52 minutes and 30 seconds. I then run Python, calculate time size is the name of my Python script. Then I just provide a time code in this format right here. So 52:30 I think is what I said. So if I know that my video is that long, I could be pretty certain that on Mac this is the size it's going to end up being. With uncompressed AVI, it is actually linear, so this is exactly what size it'll be. In fact, you can probably try it yourself and it'll probably be this exact same size. On Windows, that same file will take up this much. See, I have the GIV in parentheses. So there's those two different units of measurement. It's basically the difference between base 10 and base 2. That's why they show up differently across the platforms. It's caused so much confusion. But that's just how it is. So I think I actually have a newer version of this script. Basically, I've adjusted it for the Apple ProRes. I don't have any for DNxHR because I try not to use it at all costs if I can avoid it. But it works if I'm in a pinch. So yeah, I just wanted to show this. If you want this script, then let me know and that'll make it a higher priority for me to put it on GitHub. Eventually I'm going to put a lot of these projects on GitHub, but if you leave a comment, then this will be a priority over pretty much everything else. In fact, in my temporary notes, I've actually written down that 4 hours, 9 minutes, and 25 seconds takes up about 768.69 gigabytes. Nice. So yeah, that's basically what my estimate is. So I basically just need to put these numbers into my script and then it should handle ProRes. There might be a little bit of fluctuation though because there's slightly more compression than uncompressed AVI, but it's negligible that I can work with it. And ProRes I think is widely used in the industry as well, so it's a pretty good option if you ask me. So that's basically it for uncompressed AVI.